offered, it was always the same price. And the PSO effectively topped up generators from the market price to that fixed price offered under refit, ballpark around 70 to 80 euros a megawatt hour. So the refit, I suppose, tariff that was always being paid was very, very fixed and very certain, which meant any savings underneath this were very much on the industry side is where the benefit lied. Whereas RAISE is going to be totally different. RAISE is going to be a varying price that generators will get paid. Because we have this opportunity to potentially do it cheaper than the market price, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that raised bids are lower than the market price, and as a result, potentially paying back to the PSO, not just getting from the PSO, if we can solve this problem of getting lower raised bid prices in the first place. And I think this is a new paradigm shift. It's a new way of thinking about what has been historically called support schemes. And this is why the terminology is now turning to stabilization schemes, because the fact is that these may no longer be support. They might be just a stabilization revenue, something that's a guaranteed revenue over a certain period of time. If we can get these bid prices and raise low enough, it's very possible that instead of even being support, they're actually paying back to the PSO if we can even get them very low, similar to what other countries are achieving. So that's the prize. Let's say that's why we're motivated to do these type of things. And I should flag that, you know, it's not just a RAISE story. If we can get low cost renewable electricity prices, it really helps Ireland attract corporate PPAs as well and get foreign direct investment via renewable electricity into our economy. So that's a real, you know, real promising goal to try and chase after if we can get renewable electricity to a low price in Ireland. I think the other thing I just want to flag, and I'm not covered in this slide, is this is just purely the cost to the consumer of the PSO. The thing I haven't shown here is there's also enormous savings for the consumer on the downward pressure that's being put by wind and solar on the wholesale price of electricity. So that's a saving I'm not presenting here. We're very much focusing on bid prices and the benefit for bid prices. But this cheaper and greener study, which we did with, as I said, with AFRI towards the end of last year, that didn't just look at bid prices going in, it also looked at benefits to the consumer by reducing the wholesale price of electricity, something that the refit projects are doing now day in, day out. So we estimate that the wholesale price of electricity these days is about 20% lower because wind energy is on the electricity market. So that's another huge benefit for the consumer. But look, rather than getting lost in the detail, because there's a lot of numbers there, I'm conscious of it being thrown around. The basic point, or the main point I want to make with this slide, is what this study, and it's quite a detailed analysis that Power did for us, was they showed that if we can get the bid prices in RAISE 10 euros a megawatt hour cheaper, then the cost to the consumer is 1.5 billion euro less. So in other words, the cheaper we can make bid prices into RAISE or into corporate PPAs, ultimately it's the end consumer that's saving from this by having lower cost renewable electricity. And again, that's just going back to the really appetizing prize that's here for all of us if we can figure out a way to deliver our climate action plan targets in a cheaper way. So in this study, saving money, the total savings that we've identified that are potentially there for renewable electricity add up to 35 euros a megawatt hour. You know, there may be some synergies there that overlap, which means you don't get the full piece by the time you do all of them, but it's in that scale, and that's a 5 billion euro saving potentially, according to the work that Power did for us on cheaper and greener. That's an enormous saving, an enormous prize that we should all be focused on delivering, in my view, over the coming years. So this is the results. So we'll dive straight into what the saving money report actually showed. So what we've done here with Everose is tried to stack, you know, what are the biggest savings from left to right, looking at how we can reduce the price of mainly onshore wind, but also overlapping with offshore wind and solar over the coming years. And the ones on the left are all things that should reduce the price of renewable electricity. The ones on the right are things that, if the wrong decision is made, might actually increase the price and therefore, as a result, offset some of the savings that we've actually made. The other thing we've tried to do in this chart is to try and distinguish between what are savings that everyone will benefit from. So consumer, industry, everyone in Irish society, let's say, and they're the green savings. Whereas the one at the very end, so this tax change and also the rates change, that will, if wind farms have let's say, less of an increase. I think the one on the very right, rates, is the easiest one to distinguish from there. Right now, there's a proposal to double the price of rates per megawatt for wind farms, or sorry, triple, sorry, the price of rates for wind farms compared to what it was to what it's going to be. We think that's unfair because it means that wind energy will be paying far higher rates than many other forms of electricity generation. So if instead of tripling the price of rates for wind farms, it's only doubled, well, then that shortfall will have to be made up by others. And so that's not a direct saving for all. That's what we call a cost transfer. But I think the positive news here is, out of the 10 things we're pointing out, only 2 of them are cost transfers. Everything else are direct savings that all parts of Irish society will benefit from. I think that's where we see this as a win-win for all. So that's to explain the high-level chart that we've actually developed as part of the study. The other flagship result from this study is the 2 summary tables. Well, it's one summary table, but it spreads over 2 pages at the start of the report. And that's where we list on the left here each of the policy improvements that we think could be made to lower costs for renewable electricity. It gives a short description of each of those. It outlines who we believe would be responsible for making these changes happen. It outlines who's going to benefit from these savings. That's back to the point I made about, are the costs for everybody, or are the costs going to, in some cases, be transfers of funds rather than a saving for everyone across society? Who are the others that will benefit? And that's where I've been referring to offshore wind and solar benefit for the vast majority of these, about 7 for offshore wind and 8 out of the 10 for solar. And then finally, the actual result in terms of the percentage reduction, or potentially the cost increase if the wrong decision is made, in our view, as well as the euro per megawatt hour saving. So in the report itself, each chapter goes into each of these in detail, explains what Evero has modeled, what their underlying assumptions were, how they found the results that they did. And look, instead of in this introductory piece, because I don't want to drag this out too long, I'd like to get into the Q&A. I'm just going to leave it for the discussion, maybe to pick which one of these we might delve into in a bit more detail. But hopefully you have a flavour for what's available in the actual details of the study itself. Our big ask in IWEA, and what we think is a real opportunity, or a real next step to try and make this a reality, is we see that a lot of what we're asking for here is very cross-departmental, or goes across a number of state agencies, where the decision might be made in one part of the state and the actual benefit is seen in another. So, again, maybe just picking randomly some of these here, we have curtailment and constraints, which could be adding some of the most significant costs to the bid prices of renewable electricity in the future, but the cost of that will appear in the PSO, whereas the decision to resolve it will be primarily driven through price review 5 that the CRU are carrying out. And what we really see here is a need to make sure that those different pieces of the jigsaw are aware of what the costs and savings are in different parts of the state effectively. And in order to make those connections, that's why we feel some kind of cross-departmental or cross-state agency task force, even if just temporarily in place for 6 to 12 months, to make sure that the different actors are aware of these opportunities and these risks of either potential savings or potential price increases into the future, would be a really good way to channel this forward. So as I said, there's a full report on our website now that goes into each of these. In the Q&A, looking forward to going into some of the detail on them, but that gives you a flavour of what the structure of the results is and what it includes. The other thing, just to remind people about, like that report that Paul mentioned at the outset, 70 by 30, that was the study we started 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in the 70 by 30 committee in IWEA, to provide the evidence base for a 70% renewable electricity target carried out with Baringa. The conclusion they found when they did that analysis was, if we can deliver renewable electricity for 60 euros a megawatt hour or less, that 70% target is cheaper for the consumer than relying on fossil fuels. And again, it goes back to, this is not just a res bid price opportunity. It's not just a corporate PPA opportunity. I think there's a real opportunity here for Ireland to deliver not just clean electricity, but really good value electricity over the next decade. And at a time where the economy needs a boost and needs a recovery, I think that's a really important message for us all to be aware of. What is the opportunity here for Ireland to deliver? The other thing I just flag, it's my last slide before I give it back to Paul, maybe to kick us off on the Q&A. I think that cross-departmental task force, one thing we can certainly see as well when we look at this internally in IWEA, is a lot of the decisions made in the next 12 24 months are really going to set the tone for the next 2 decades. And the reason I say that is, if people factor in these costs and savings into their raised bid prices, they're then locked in for 15 years, for example, in raise. So it's the views people will have on these things developing over the next year or two that will very much define what price the consumer pays for renewable electricity for the next 10, 15 years plus. And I suppose we want to flag that we can really see a lot of savings with the proposals we have on the table can be made if we have things like a very solid policy and regulatory framework in the short term, i.e. in the next 12 months or so. So we really see value in more resources within the likes of the Department of Communications, Climate Action, Housing and Planning, on board Planola and the regional assemblies to make sure that we have that strong policy framework in place, as well as more resources and funding for EirGrid and ESB networks in the price review 5 that the CRU are carrying out, so that we can really send the signal to people bidding into raise that things like constraints and curtailment and grid connections will be low cost over the next 15 years or so. Because if we do that in the next 1 to 2 years, then as we open the raise auctions, that's really going to have a profound impact, in our view, on lowering wind bid prices, lowering the PSO effectively, and potentially attracting more corporate PPAs, which again is the win-win that we see on every side right now, on both the carbon front as well as on the cost front for for our Irish society. So look, I hope that give people a conscious of time as well, and people are joining when webinar. Was keen to open it up for the discussion as soon as possible. That's a bit of a whistle stop. So Paul, I might pass it back to you there and see which part of it we might go into in a bit more detail.
Very good. Yeah, thanks, David. And yeah, maybe just to encourage everyone on the webinar to feel free to start submitting their questions as they arise as we work through it. And maybe before even flagging a few questions of my own, just to comment on your last slide there, David. Like I think a key consideration here for regulators and department is to differentiate between things that are costs versus things that are investments that could generate a return for consumers. So there will be a tendency when you look at, like say in the context of say the price review 5 process, where we're investing in things like DS3 plus, investing in things like network reinforcements, at the transmission and distribution level, that's viewed as a cost where money goes out but nothing comes back. In terms of how Ireland approaches this, I think it's really important that we look at that not as a cost but as an investment, and if we make smart investments in the right places and that can generate a return for people over time. So that's maybe just an observation on your last slide to call out at this stage. Like in terms of just kicking things off with questions, like let's start with the big stuff first. The tip height increases, rotor diameter increases came through extremely strongly in the Everose analysis there in terms of cost savings. So I don't know, David, if you'd like to speak to that a little bit more in terms of where Ireland might sit internationally in terms of tip heights and rotor diameters being deployed in the country, and what needs to happen to move the dial on that, maybe both at an industry level and at a policy regulatory level.
Yeah, so look, I think absolutely, Paul. Like the savings there when you get additional height on an onshore wind farm are enormous. I think it took us all a bit by surprise when we saw the initial results come through from Everose, just the scale of that. I think what really kind of demonstrated that to me, and I might just share just one other slide that kind of really put this up in lights, just how influential the tip height can be, is this is a slide from that Vestas provide as part of a promotional video they run. It's just showing the scale of additional power that you can produce from an onshore wind farm with a relatively small increase in tip height. So on the left, you have a 125 meter tip height wind turbine. It's a 2 megawatt machine. If you increase that by just 25 meters, you've upgraded from a 2 megawatt machine to a 3.6 megawatt machine. So that's an enormous jump in power output for a relatively small increase in height. And that's why, let's say that's the core reason, at least, why the underlying cost or the underlying LCOE from onshore wind plays such a significant role when you relate it to the tip height. Because obviously if you have this much more power, you're getting an awful lot more electricity for the same turbine. You're getting an awful lot more electricity means you can produce the electricity at a much lower cost. So that's the fundamental principle behind why the tip height has such a strong influence. Like I think the other point I'll make on that is just like obviously the most influential factor for us right now is the wind energy guidelines that are taking place and what final result they'll come to. The proposal is to go with a 4 times setback for onshore wind farms in the future. I think the current pipeline can survive at that. Of course, it's going to be a big jump from what we're used to with the 500-meter setback. So it'll probably be typically more in the region of 750, 800 meters at least of a tip of a setback distance. It's going to reduce the land available for onshore wind. There was a study done by NUI Maynooth not so long ago that showed that this amount of land you use when you increase tip height is very significant. We think with going from 500 meters to a 4 times tip height, we'll probably lose about 40% of the land available for onshore wind. But the good news is that we still have lots of potential for onshore wind, so we still feel like we can meet the climate action plan targets, and there's enough land left. So I think the key thing is there that we don't go any further than the 4 times setback, or we could really ease into that cost saving and the onshore wind potential. But it's very much that relationship between the tip height and the amount of power you can produce being so significant that makes that price come down so substantially.
Yeah, and I suppose in terms of where Ireland then sits internationally, like if you look to other countries like Germany, the Nordics, where you are seeing these very, very low bid prices in auctions, just maybe to give a sense as to how is that being achieved and what kind of turbine dimensions are being deployed in those countries.
Yeah, so like if you go back to that LCOE graph I showed from Wind Europe, or sorry, the bid price graph I showed from Wind Europe, it's very much driven, those downward pressure on bid prices is hugely driven by taller turbines in other countries. So we know that some countries are exceeding 200 meters now in terms of their turbine tip heights. I think in Ireland, the most likely thing we'll see in the coming decade is probably in the region of 150 to 200, which is very typical of what the latest wind farms have been built at in Ireland as well. So the WEGs may very much set a plateau there or set an upper limit in that space. But certainly in other countries, they're going beyond that because they see the cost benefits of going taller, and we're seeing that everywhere else. Actually, one thing I might just share in terms of tip heights, which I think is a really nice photo, is the very first wind farm built in Ireland back in 1992 is Bellacarrick, and there's been a wind farm just built beside that original wind farm very recently, Owenini. And this is a picture of the original wind farm in the front of the picture, which you can see is some relatively small turbines that are only 50 meters high. And you can see the brand new Owenini turbines in the background. But effectively, it's a funny situation where the 22 original turbines that were put in there can now be replaced by 2 of these new turbines because the amount of power that's being produced by these new turbines is so much more. So again, you've almost probably tripled the height, but you've got 10 times the power, and that's really why the price is driven so low. It's just a nice photo, I think, in an Irish context that we have to demonstrate what can be achieved.
Yeah, and I guess also in Ireland we're fortunate in terms of the wind resource itself is so much better than some of those other countries that even without pushing to the very extreme tip heights that you see in those countries, we are able to generate very good value. Maybe to shift topics a little bit as well. So another one of the key ones there that came up in the analysis was noise. And I suppose I'm conscious that at the time that report was being prepared and that analysis was being carried out, we would have had some sort of a sense in terms of the limits that were being proposed. But we've since seen, the more detailed methodologies and the draft WEGs themselves, and more detail around how those limits might be imposed. So I don't know if you have any thoughts in terms of, have things changed since this analysis was carried out, and I suppose where are we today on it?
Yeah, I suppose just to fill people in, probably in terms of IWEA's timelines in the background over the last 12 months, like this analysis was predominantly completed in Q3 of last year. There's actually a presentation on our website from our autumn conference last year where Everose presented the first results when they were coming out. So at that time, like the wind energy guidelines consultation came out in December of last year. So you're right, Paul, in terms of visibility, we had no idea at that stage what actually may or may not be the finer details of the noise guidance. So just to fill people in, like what was the underlying assumptions? So the current, let's say, noise limits in Ireland are in the region of 43 to 45 decibels. The high level, kind of the preferred draft approach that was publicly available around the wind energy guidelines when we did this analysis, it didn't give a lot of the detail, but it just suggested that the new limits were somewhere in the region of 35 to 43. So let's say the noise experts had to advise us then how to apply that 35 to 43, which we didn't know at the time how the wind energy guidelines would propose to apply it. We did like a test on 10 wind farms then to see what is the additional time that you would have to turn off an onshore wind farm by having these more restrictive noise limits in place, going from the 43, 45 range to the 35 to 43 range. And based on the amount of energy you're losing there, which is pretty enormous numbers, like you're talking about enough electricity to power some of the largest cities in Ireland being lost because we're turning off turbines due to those noise limits. That obviously means if you can produce less electricity, it's more expensive to build your wind farm, or your per unit of electricity price goes up. So I think with that backdrop, the 11 euros a megawatt hour number that Evro has found, I think is safe to say that that's probably a best case scenario, because I think what came out in the wind energy guidelines was far more restrictive and unclear than we had envisaged. Anyone who's been following that in detail is probably aware that there's been an independent group of acousticians that have flagged numerous errors in the methodology around the noise aspects of the wind energy guidelines. That in itself would make it extremely challenging to try and show compliance with, and increase risk and increase cost around doing so. So I think the noise numbers in this is probably a conservative view. It's very much linked to just a pure impact on 1 decibel level to another, but it isn't taken into account a huge amount of issues that have been flagged to us by our members and some experts in the field of acoustics in replying to the wind energy guidelines submission that closed last February. I think as well, just like some things to put into context for people, because in my own naivety, I thought when I entered that space about a year and a half ago, you almost think like it's a matter of, you measure a noise, it's all very clear what you're measuring, and you have to keep below it. But the art of noise is a very complex area. It's open to a lot of different interpretations about how something should be applied, or should be moved from a limit to actually in practice. And I think our message has always been that this Institute of Acoustics, they have an extremely well developed and robust methodology in the UK that they developed over many years in huge consultation with a number of other stakeholders. And like we see it working extremely effectively. And I might just share some of the numbers from Northern Ireland, which uses that standard that I think people might find of use. So I just bring something up here. This is the number of noise complaints that are registered in Northern Ireland every year across all sectors. And as you can see from these is official statistics reported by the department up there, out of 11,700 noise complaints, only 20 in the year 2017-18 related to onshore wind farms. So that's 0.1% of all noise complaints. So that's, in our view, demonstrate that that's clearly a very effective, approach, a clearly very robust approach that's proven very, very reliable in terms of making sure that the noise that people are exposed to is very much within acceptable levels, if there isn't the complaints coming through at scale. So like our view on this has always been that that's such a complex area, there's so many variables in it, that the safest approach is almost to take a well-proven, robust, Northern Ireland and the Republic operate on a single electricity market. This seems like a very promising way to go in terms of what Ireland does with its final noise guidance, and would avoid us having to add too many excessive costs to our underlying price of onshore wind in particular.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's a lot of very good points in that, and I mean, there is a balance here, because we do, the industry actually wants and needs appropriate and robust guidance, because without that, you could almost undermine the delivery side. So, like, we certainly don't want to have projects being developed where we are creating genuine noise problems for people. But so what we're looking, I suppose, for is appropriate limits that ensure that, let's say, local amenity is protected, but also then robust methodologies to make sure that where those limits are defined, that they're let's say properly policed and robustly implemented. So there's the kind of cost impact in terms of the absolute levels themselves, and whether we're getting the right balance there. I think the WEGs did speak to that, striking the right balance in terms of defending the local interest versus the implications of that in terms of potential cost to consumers.
Yeah, the only thing I'd flag there, Paula, just to come back in on that, is like kind of leading from what I was trying to really emphasize in my introduction, though, the WEGs didn't include any evaluation of the impact on cost of those decisions, so like that's just a huge gap, like, is there an awareness that these decisions are not just about, what noise level you have, but they're about adding billions of euro to the price of meeting our climate action plan targets. And that's what I really think this Everose piece of work has done. It's filled a really important gap in the knowledge base, I think, in that space. Like, because like one thing that I always try to remind people, like this conversation me and you are having is probably 55, 60 decibels. The limits we're talking about here are, 35 to 43. Like they're in the ballpark of the fridge hum that you hear in your home. Like that's fine. And of course we all like to make as little inconvenience as possible. But when you balance that against adding billions of euro to people's bills, I think there's an element of balance that was just missing there in the wind energy guidelines consultation that is really, really important, because it's a huge challenge over the next decade to deliver this infrastructure. Price is going to be very important in that, because especially as we try and recover from a pandemic. And I think it's really important we add the price implications and the deliverability almost as a further element of balance in all of that.
No, yeah, no, look, I think that's key. And I mean, I think that there's a fundamental question there as well in terms of the limits we've been working to, like to the extent that there have been, a small number of projects where there have been genuine issues. Was the problem the limits, or was the problem the implementation of those limits? And I think that's maybe a key question. And as you say, that should have been probably a key consideration in formulating the WEGs themselves. But look, there's probably a little road to travel there on that yet in terms of where they land. Maybe to move on to maybe one of the other key points there, David. So the constraint and curtailment also featured quite strongly in terms of the potential impact on costs. So maybe let's delve a little deeper into that.
Yeah, look, I think we're about to go into hardcore engineering, and I know there was a webinar we did for members there only a few weeks ago, and myself and Noel Kniff and IWEA spent quite a while just explaining constraints and curtailment and the impacts of those. So I might just start by just bringing up some of the material we covered at that, just to try and maybe give people an introduction to what we mean by constraints and curtailment. If I can just find some slides we used on the day here. So I think this might be a good one just to start with. Or actually, you know what, I might go back even a step further if I can find it. Yeah, I might just start here, and Paul, feel free to maybe jump in here to make sure that I'm kind of explaining this, because this is a very, very complex area, and we're really trying to communicate a very complex subject matter here in a lot of different ways. But like, dispatch down is an overarching term that we use to cover both constraints and curtailment, but I'd very quickly just like to maybe run through what curtailment is versus what constraints is, just so people can know what we're talking about. And in the Saving Money report, they're categorized separately because we believe the solutions are in a large degree separate solutions. So on the curtailment side, at the moment there's something called the SNSP limit on the electricity grid, which is a limit for how much wind energy predominantly can supply electricity. It's about to become 70% of all our electricity demands at any one time. So if that limit is in place, if you look at the electricity demand on the system at any given time, and you look at the 70% limit of that, if wind power exceeds that 70% limit, well, the difference between the limit and what wind energy is producing is curtailment. It's electricity that isn't actually produced, and the wind farms are actually turned down so that they don't exceed this SNSP limit. And then as a result, we get some curtailment. So I think I have a graph of a 24-hour period just to kind of show that. So this is a graph that shows over a 24-hour day. The blue line is the total electricity demand for the day, and the orange line is the SNSP limit. And then the gray line is the amount of wind power that's actually being produced. And as you can see, when the wind power exceeds the limit, the wind actually doesn't produce this electricity in yellow, it actually gets turned off. And that effectively becomes curtailment. And that's electricity that wind farms could produce, but as a result of the limit on the electricity grid, didn't actually produce. So that's maybe a good first starting point. I think on curtailment, or sorry, on constraints, then I might just briefly explain what we mean by that. So hopefully I'll just bring up something here. So constraints then are a bit different. Sorry, my slide deck is just jumping a bit, I think, just with the connection, a bit of a delay on my side. So hopefully you can see that, Paul, can you? So the constraints piece. So just to explain then, the constraints then is something very different. So if you have an electricity demand in one part of the country and you have wind farms producing electricity in another part of the country, they have to be connected by some kind of electricity grid or infrastructure. And if the capacity of the cable is not sufficient to take all the electricity produced from the wind farm to the demand that's needed, well, obviously that's lost. Some of that electricity is lost from the wind farm, and as a result, the wind farm can't produce that additional electricity because there's a restriction on the amount of capacity available on the electricity grid to get it to the demand centers. So that's what we term as constraints. And I suppose the reason I just wanted to really flag that difference is because the solutions then become a bit different. One is about how do we increase the limit, or the SNSP limit, on our electricity grid to accommodate more variable electricity across the whole system. The other is how do we make sure that where we produce electricity is able to get the electricity. So with constraints, it's about having enough grid capacity to get production to demand. For curtailment, it's about getting the electricity that the limit that we have overall in our grid for variables up to a higher level. I think just a flag in our view in IWEA, on the onshore side, we think there's around 2.5 gigs of capacity in the electricity system before what we call major upgrades are needed. For offshore on the East Coast, based on the EirGrid East Coast study, we think there's about 1.5 to 2 gigs of capacity there before major upgrades are needed. I don't know, Paul, if you want to say anything around that, since you were very much the brains behind the 70 by 30 committee putting that together, but I think there will be different types of solutions to these things, but that's probably gives people a flavor of, when we try to deliver on the climate action plan, there will be some works needed to make sure there's more capacity on the grid over the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have too much to add to that. I mean, I suppose the key point is that, there's a very, very strong direction of travel to try and decarbonize the energy system completely. And one of the most promising strategies overall, I would say, is renewable electricity combined with electrification of heat and transport. And in very, very simple terms, what we're saying here is that if you're effectively trying to do a lot more to electrify your energy system, you need to be able to carry the power, which means you need capacity on the wires, both at the transmission and the distribution level. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to drive home in this space is it's quite important that you're willing to take a longer term view as to where we're heading to. So it's not enough. It's like some of these major upgrade projects. Historically they've taken well over 10 years to develop from the time you start working on them. So it's when you're talking about the transmission and distribution networks, you probably need to be taking even longer term views as to directionally where are we going as a country. So look, I think that's one of the big ones. I think if you were looking at what are the potential obstacles to achieving what we're trying to achieve, investment in the network is certainly one of the big ones from my perspective.
Yeah, and that's us back to the whole, let's say, investing in grid infrastructure via PR5, Price Review 5 now saves lots of money on the bid prices, but that'll only be visible later. But it's almost like you need one to trigger the other, around constraints and curtailment and that type of thing. So the other thing I might just go back to there, sorry, Paul, is the just that graph I had to show curtailment and how when you exceed the limit that you get additional curtailment. Just a flag that constraints can happen even when you're not near that limit. And that's because constraints can happen due to a local bottleneck in the grid capacity available. So again, that's just a flag, a very important, I think, nuance between the two, that one is, let's say, a system-wide limit problem. The other is can be at least a local bottleneck problem. And just to fill the people in on this study from Everose, what they did was they took a view as to, in a world where these problems are not fixed, we could see both curtailment and constraints going up over the next decades before they become so extreme that they're eventually resolved, versus a situation where they're actually resolved in advance. And that's where the basis for the cost saving comes from. That's where you're actually going to get much lower bid prices into RES if people take the view that constraints and curtailment are likely to be low. But the only reason they'd view those as likely to be low if they see the signals coming that the solutions are going to be invested in to fix them. I think that's kind of captures the essence of what they were trying to show in the analysis.
Yeah, and I think the last point you made there is also key, that the analysis, and the one thing the analysis didn't look at, I suppose, is the uncertainty around this. So, as a renewable generator bidding into a RES auction today, we don't have perfect foresight as to where, when these mitigation measures will be introduced and how effective they'll be. And in effect, to the point you made earlier, whatever view we land on, as bidders in auctions as to where these figures will land, they will feed directly into the prices that consumers will be paying for the next 15 years. So, if we've got very high uncertainty, we're not really too sure how quickly these mitigation measures might be implemented, and that causes us to take a slightly pessimistic view as to where curtailment might get to. When you implement the solutions later, that cost is still locked in based on the existing manner in which constraint and curtailment risk is allocated. So while it was probably outside the scope of this particular study, I think that's certainly an area that as we move forward, we should look to develop further and look to kind of maybe challenge the existing risk allocations for constraint and curtailment. So maybe that's just a few further comments from my side in that space. I mean, we could dig a lot deeper, David, into precisely what you need to do in terms of curtailment mitigation. So you've obviously the DS3 plus to try and increase that SNSP limit up to 95% being ERGO's target, and then the deployment of interconnectors and market designs to support efficient interconnector operation will be another key one. And I suppose on the interconnectors as well, it's very important to note that they're not just a solution to curtailment, but they're also a solution to capacity adequacy. So effectively at the times when wind isn't blowing as strongly, those interconnectors can also serve to provide capacity to meet demand in the country as well during those periods. So that's maybe a few other important points in that curtailment space that are worth noting. I might just take one more question from my side, and I might hand over to Justin then, who's going to be posing questions to myself and David, I think from the people on the webinar. So maybe last one from my side, David, is maybe just a little bit to speak to the point on life extension, and maybe just to expand on that point a little bit further.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really, really interesting one, because like certainly before this analysis was done, I certainly didn't see the scale of that benefit jumping through. So just to bring people back so that you know what we're talking about here, this is item number 3 in the Everose work, was looking at what is the euro per megawatt hour benefits of going from traditionally what has been 20-year planning lifetimes for wind farms out to 30-year planning lifetimes. And to be honest, I'm not even sure we need to stop there, because the saving with just doing that 10-year extension is a €7.5 per megawatt hour saving. That's again billions of euro potentially that the consumer can save just by changing what is predominantly kind of a practice rather than anything that's kind of legally set in stone, because our understanding is that like other infrastructure isn't given like a time restricted planning permission. It's very common for other infrastructure, especially in electricity generation, to have an indefinite planning period. So that seems like a really easy win. I don't think it necessarily requires a huge change in terms of, let's say, what the law is in Ireland or anything like that. It's almost a change in on board Planola and local authority practices. And considering again, I think this is again, I'll reiterate this point over and over, if those stakeholders were aware of just how significant that saving could translate into consumers saving billions of euro in terms of bid prices, for such a small change, it could be a really attractive thing to do. And again, it's kind of back to our kind of task force request in IWEA, that we feel that some of these changes is almost like just filling in the blanks of putting the scale of the cost savings that are available there on the table, and that nearly makes some of these solutions really appetizing, because there's such big benefits on the cost side.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's a huge one, and like as you look to the overall implementation plan for 70%, I mean, there are certainly things there that will be challenging and difficult to deliver, but I think that certainly comes under the quick, easy win category, and quite a substantial win as well, based on the analysis we've seen. So.
Yeah, and it's relevant for onshore, offshore, solar. So that's again across every form of renewable electricity that we try to generate over the next decade. So I think that's just, in terms of low-hanging fruit, that seems like a really big win. That's relatively easy to implement, especially if you compare it to the likes of, the amount of effort that we're going to need on the constraints and curtailment side of the house to achieve a similar saving for each of those. This is a matter of months. You could probably, I imagine, implement this, whereas constraints and curtailment is going to take a solid effort over the next decade to try and make sure we achieve the what we need there.
Very good, very good. Look, with that, I might hand over to Justin and his magnificent beard to see if he can communicate any questions that are coming through on the webinar. I think I see a few birds nesting there.
Like 3-4 months solid work here now to get to this point. We've got a good few questions in from people. I might take a couple of them in batches, but just to encourage people to continue to put questions forward. The first one, actually, Dave, this to yourself, is just a quick clarification on your presentation. You spoke about a benefit for the Irish electricity consumer of potentially more than 5 billion euros. We have a question from one of the viewers wanting to know over what time period this saving would be appearing.
Yeah, so again, just to make sure people know, there's a full study by AFRI on that on our website called Cheaper and Greener, so you can get the full, let's say, nuts and bolts details around all of it. But just the quick answer for that one is it's over the 15 years of a RES auction period is where they did that analysis. So I would again see that as a relatively conservative view, because wind farms, and this is what we were just talking about with the life extension piece, like Bellacarrick was built in 92, it's still operating today. It was the very first wind farm. That's 28 years later. You know, new wind farms will be even better, should be lasting at least 30 plus years. So that particular analysis was done over looking at just the 15-year period, because that's the tenure we expect under RES. But I would certainly think it's a relatively short view, because wind farms will offer savings not just for 15 years, but for their full lifetime, which will be 30 years plus.
Okay. We've a couple of questions on corporate PPAs. We kind of might divide them up between the two of you just as a group. So one of the viewers pointed out that you mentioned them a couple of times in the presentation, and he's making the point, which I don't think anybody would disagree with, that they haven't really taken off in Ireland yet. He wants to know, is cost the only reason, or are there others? And then a couple of other queries that came on from people on the same topic. How can we encourage big energy users to sign PPAs? Should they be obliged to do that? Should they be obliged and forced to use renewable energy for their system? So just a couple of questions there on the corporate PPA topic I might take up between the two of you.
Do you want to go, Paul? And
yeah, sure. I mean, I think certainly cost is a factor, and again, if you look in Ireland, you know, up until relatively recently, and you know, an awful lot of the wind farms that have been consented and had grid offers were probably 125-meter tip heights, and you know, it's very, very challenging with those kinds of turbine dimensions to get costs to the point where they're comparable with say average prices in the wholesale markets. Now, what I would say is that separately we've done studies that have showed that like part of the reason why they're above the wholesale market price is that when you have a lot of wind on the system, it drives down the wholesale market price. So even when we were talking about refit prices, you know, there have been multiple studies have shown that actually represented quite good value when you considered the impact of that wind on the system. But as a corporate, I suppose you're looking at the wholesale price of electricity, which has already been driven down by that wind, and you're comparing that with what you would have to procure new wind at, and yeah, in simple terms, you know, I think it's challenging while the price is still above the market price. But what I think you will see, I mean, we have seen the first corporate PPAs signed in Ireland now. I think Amazon have done, I think, 2. And as we start to deploy newer technologies, you know, I think you will see more of that happening, and I think there's probably a growing awareness in the corporate sector as well in terms of the corporate social responsibility aspect, that they do want to do more, they do need to do more. So yeah, in terms of maybe mandating them or forcing them to buy it, not too sure what that would look like, and I'm not too sure we need to go there. You know, I think a lot of them are showing that this is something they're keen to do and they want to do, and I'm not sure it would be necessary to mandate that they have to. And I suppose if they didn't as well, you know, they would also be paying the PSO levy, as I understand it. David might correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I mean, I would assume that as consumers that they would also be paying the PSO levy. So you know, they'll be paying a share either way. That would be my
right now as it stands, it is, Paul. Yeah, so even if you sign a corporate PPA, you're still subject to the PSO levy as well. So like that could be a way to incentivize it. You could say, I think I'd be very much in agreement with you. Like you know, should we look at obliging it maybe down the road? But isn't the quick win here, if it's not only a good thing for your corporate social responsibility because it's green, but it's also a good thing for your bottom line, then it becomes a no-brainer for everyone. And look, I think what we're trying to flag in this Saving Money report is there's no reason Ireland shouldn't be able to offer renewable electricity, especially through onshore wind, at really low cost, you know. And if these changes were implemented, that's, you know, that when you add them all up, they have the price of onshore wind in Ireland. That's brings it right in line with some of the lowest cost countries around Europe. We have the first or second best resource in Europe. We should certainly have the lowest or second lowest price to fit with that. Just to let people know on the corporate PPA backdrop, so the climate action plan, is looking to deliver 15% of our electricity demand from corporate PPAs. So like by our kind of rough numbers, looking at demand growth out over the next 10 years, so it's not just 70%, but it's 70% of a much bigger demand as well. So you can see, hopefully, if you can see my, I see my pointer has gone to blank, so I'll just bring that up. So on the left, this is the demand as of 2020. On the right is the demand as of 2030, as it's forecast to be. If you take 15% of that, our estimates are that it's in the region of 2,500 megawatts of onshore wind equivalent. That's enormous volumes of corporate PPAs that we're going to try and procure in the next decade. In my view, the only way that happens is if it's a carrot rather than a stick. If you make it that no-brainer, that it's not just a cleaner solution, but it's actually a better for your bottom line as well. And that's where we'd really hope the recommendations from this Saving Money report are taken on board to not only help with the PSO side with RES, but also help with the corporate PPA and actually literally bring investment into Ireland from abroad into our clean energy sector.
Okay, thanks, lads. We've a couple of questions together now as well on the area of noise that David touched on a little bit. And David, I think you were talking about the potential scenarios, what we're arguing for in IWEA, and also what's in I suppose the draft WEGs at the moment. Could you talk a little bit more about what you think is the most likely outcome, and also how you think we stand in Ireland in comparison to other countries? And then a second question I might just bring in, if the noise limits are reduced, does that mean that existing turbines will need to be decommissioned or retrofitted or operated on reduced hours? So 2 questions there. What do you think is the most likely outcome, and how do we stand against other European countries? And if the noise limits are reduced, what does this mean for the existing turbine fleet?
Yeah, great. Sure, I'll start with those, and Paul, feel free to jump in as well. So the Wind Europe view of the proposals in the wind energy guidelines is that the limit being proposed would, and I quote, by some distance, be one of the lowest and harshest limits in all of Europe. So just to put into context, the proposals in the wind energy guidelines are absolutely on the strictest ends of the scale as to what any other country in Europe is doing. There may be 1 or 2 other countries that are right there up with us, but the vast majority of others are behind us. So it's very much on the strictest ends of the scale. And what's most likely, I think on all aspects except the noise, I probably feel like I have a good gut sense, like as in, 4 times setback was in the preferred draft approach around the WEGs. It was in the final decision. Industry can survive with it. It is a big loss on land area, but we can still meet our target. So that seems like a fairly likely outcome. On the noise, I simply don't know. And I think, like, just to give people a flavor, in IWEA's consultation response, we outlined 309 technical issues with the methodology on noise. That is, it was 50 pages of our consultation was just pointing to errors, not necessarily that we disagreed with limits, but just errors in the way that it was pieced together. And how many of those are resolved or tried to be reconsidered, we don't know. And as I said, because there's so many errors there, our view is very much, these noise guidelines take years to check, sense check, make sure they're robust. We can't afford in Ireland to wait. We've already been 7 years waiting for this to be resolved. We can't wait more years, and we need certainty in this space. So why not just pick something that's proven? But I honestly don't know which way it will run its course. You'd hope almost that, especially with the independent group of noise experts flagging the concerns there, that there would be a recognition that at the very least, whatever limits might be, you need something that's technically robust, or else an industry can't do it. And the last one with the existing fleet, no, it won't apply to the existing fleet until they go back for repowering. That's the same in any aspect of Irish society. Like when new building regulations come out, you don't retrospectively apply building regulations to the entire building stock that Ireland has. You apply building regulations as things are renovated or as new ones are built. So that would be the same principle with wind farms as every other part of society, you could say.
We've one more question on noise, and we might then move on to, we've a cluster of questions on constraints or curtailment to get to. But on noise, it's a question about the analysis. does it assume that all of the so the analysis as presented in the Everose research, does it assume that all the turbines in the wind farm would have the same tip height and all would be affected to comply with noise limits, or would the effect of complying with the noise limits only be on those that would be closer to, to somebody's house or an inhabited residence?
Yeah. No, it was only on the ones closest. So let's say the curtailment impact of the limits was done through very detailed acoustic modeling, like literally taking a sample across existing turbines, existing fleet, and in development projects, and looking at what was the average impact for the exact layout with the exact neighbors, with the exact, let's say, local wind conditions, and on average across those 10 wind farms, what was the average amount of power that was lost in, let's say, as close to real world modeling as you could do through an acoustic model.
I might just come back in for a second there, Justin. Yeah, sorry, just on the earlier point. So previously I would have worked for an international wind farm development company, and I would have consulted or would have had regular enough meetings with colleagues in different countries. And something that kind of came up that was quite interesting in the context of the French market, so that the French market would also have extremely onerous noise regulations. And I was at a presentation one day where they were showing me a piece of analysis on one of their projects, and they were showing 9% output reductions to mitigate noise. And I kind of put my hand up and said, I assume that means you don't build the project. And the answer was very strongly, no, we do. We just have to factor in that we lose 9% of the energy to comply with these limits. And if you look at auction prices in the French market and put them beside the German market or other markets, you do see a very definite higher price in that market. And I can't say I've done precise analysis to, in terms of statistical significance, but anecdotally, I think the very onerous noise limits in that market are certainly contributing to higher costs. And I think that's really the key point here. Like, this is not really something that's going to cost developers. As we move to competitive auctions, the nature of competition is our margins will be squeezed to the lowest level that we're prepared to bid into in that competitive environment. But we all have to comply with whatever the rules are. And so effectively what will happen if these onerous limits are imposed is that we'll just factor those into our bid prices, we'll bid it in, and still some projects will clear. And it's really just a question of, these very onerous limits are going to come with a significant cost, and are we really happy as a country that that's the right thing to do? But that's maybe just in terms of the international perspective, just I thought that might be a useful example to share.
I think it's very important, Paul, because it basically shows that this is not hypothetical. You can literally look at other countries and see it happen already. Like, I think that's really important as well, because I think sometimes when we talk about this stuff, whether it be the extremely low prices that onshore wind is clearing at in other countries, or whether it be the consequences of a poor/strict regulatory regime, this is not like an IWEA hypothetical what might happen in the next decade. This is, look to our EU neighbours. You can literally see the prices being delivered at a low price in places where there is a very streamlined policy regulatory regime, and at high prices where there's not. And it's that is it. Like, it's not like it's this might happen and be careful. It's this will happen because it has happened here in a good way and it has happened there in a bad way. And if I was to point to those two, I think Nordics is probably a really good kind of benchmark for some of the good things, and France is probably a good, at least on around that piece, a good benchmark for some of the bad things.
Thanks, lads. Paul, we might drop a note into the Department of Housing. I think they're still working on the WEGS guidelines, so maybe we'll bring them up to date on the situation in France. I said a couple of questions, quite short questions here, so you guys might be able to get through them pretty quickly. So I'm going to take the three together. So first of all, regarding constraints, what do the two of you think is the best and the quickest thing we can do to reduce constraints in the system? That's the first question. The second question, with regard to the point David was making about curtailment, do you think this is going to lead to greater use of battery storage on the electricity system in the next 5 to 10 years? And then the final question in the area, presumably with the clean energy package coming forward and with it requiring compensation for constraint and curtailment, this is going to provide the necessary economic signals that will actually accelerate grid development and address the issue. Maybe if you could take those three questions. Best and quickest thing to reduce constraints, is curtailment going to mean more battery storage? And is the clean energy package and the requirement for compensation going to be a big part of the solution?
So, Paul, I'm happy to take this if you want me to.
Sure, you go first, David. Yeah, and I'll chip in at the end. And if I've
Perfect. And what I might do as well is I might use some slides to just help me through this one, because I think some of those might really benefit from having something on my screen. In terms of what are the quickest things for constraints, 2 quick slides I'll show is one. We have this slide from, let's say, that I just went over in my introductory presentation, but just to flag that what's coming out in our next study, the Building Onshore Wind study, is IWEA's view of how much capacity is available across the country and what kind of things would be done to fix those problems with capacity that would require either 2 years to implement, 4 years to implement, or 8 years to implement. Where we look at like 2-year things as stuff like smart network solutions, 4-year things as upgrading existing line capacity, and 8-year things as building new lines in some places, depending on how much develops in each of those areas. So I think if I was to come to the specific question, what are the easiest things? I think upgrading capacity on existing lines is probably the easy wins. And, happy to take your views there, Paul, as well. I know it's a space you know a lot more than I do in, but I think there's a lot of different ideas about what you could do there. I won't go into each one individually, but I just keep it short and sweet. Justin, for your question, I'd say upgrading existing lines is probably the low-hanging fruit. And then the more difficult longer-term fix is trying to build new lines depending on where the capacity is developing across the country in time.
Yeah, maybe a key point I'll add to that is it's not just about the constraints, it's about the uncertainty of what the constraints will be in terms of a model. And if I was trying to think of, there's kind of complex, I would say, solutions in terms of risk allocation that we're working on within IWEA that we're at the early stages on it. If I was to try and point to quick wins in terms of certainty, I would say firm access policy is a key one, and softening the definition of firm would create an awful lot of extra firm space on the system, and combined with the provisions in the clean energy package, assuming they were to be implemented the way we believe they should be, where firm generators will be compensated for constraints, that would introduce a high degree of certainty. So I think firm access policy.
Just jump in there, Paul, just to explain to people who are not familiar that the difference between firm and non-firm. Just maybe you want to just give a quick.
Yeah, sure, David. Yeah.
I'll leave it to you. Do you want to take it? Because you probably.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I suppose under existing requirements, in order to be given firm access to the system, effectively, the system operator needs to be able to guarantee that you can export your entire output at all times. And they apply, that would apply during a contingency event. So if a line goes down, that the line that you're on wouldn't become overloaded. So effectively, it's a very, very high bar. And when you analyze how much constraints occur when you go a little bit beyond the physical limit of the line, there's very little constraints for the first. Like if you take 110 kV line, you can probably overinstall by 15 or 20% before you start to see very material constraints arising on that line. And in today's world, if the line has a capacity of 170 megawatts in terms of a summer rating, if your megawatt number 180, then you can't get given firm access. And given that you must be firm in order to be compensated, the absence or the being allocated firm versus non-firm has the potential to have a very material impact on the level of certainty around the constraints that you would bid into an auction. Sorry, David, I'm going to ask you to help me, because being an engineer, I tend to go too complicated. Have I made that too complicated?
Yeah, no, look, I think just 2 things to flag. One is whether you're firm or non-firm is now vital, because it defines whether you're compensated or not. And that means the definition of what firm and non-firm becomes vital, because whether you become defined as firm or not is really important. And I think what you're pointing out there, Paul, is that the definition right now is an extremely high bar and an extremely kind of encompasses all cases all the time. Whereas if that definition was, let's say, slightly relaxed, it would cover the majority of cases most of the time, and as a result provide a lot more certainty for people now as to what their constraints levels are likely to be, effectively that they're likely to be a lot less, I think is what, to sum it up.
Yeah, and I think on the dynamic line, like on some of those solutions, if you take something like dynamic line rating, like that wouldn't provide any extra firm capacity as defined today. But if you soften the definition of firm, that you can have up to 1% constraints and still be classified as firm, then when you introduce something like dynamic line ratings, now you're creating a huge amount more firm space with more certainty associated with that. So I think that's maybe you know, like a lot of those solutions, okay, some of them would create more firm space, but others wouldn't. So like, yeah, softer definition of firm, compensate for constraints for firm generators. You know, those measures would certainly create a lot of extra capacity with associated certainty on the system that would really help us drive down prices in auctions.
Yeah, and then just the other one, because I'm just conscious of time as well for people on the curtailment side. I think this is a really great table that was put together by both ourselves, IWEA, in collaboration with Energy Storage Ireland in a report that we launched at the end of last year. So if anyone just check that out on our website or on the Energy Storage Ireland website, store, respond and save. But it just lists, you know, as we start to replace power stations with variable renewable electricity, predominantly wind power, what we're losing are the system services that power stations used to provide almost as a byproduct of being electricity generators. So let's say a power plant was built to produce electricity, able to provide lots of system services to the grid while doing that, but a wind farm can't do that to the same extent and is very limited with some of those system services that they provide. So what we've been doing with Energy Storage Ireland is looking at, well, what are those system services and what type of technologies could work with wind farms in the future to provide those system services without relying on power stations. So effectively, wind plus these technologies should provide the level of system services we need to get us to the 95% SNSP limit rather than stuck at the 65 to 70% that we're currently at. So I think batteries are a huge part of that. I think they're definitely going to help provide a lot of these services, but there's a few others in there as well that I think through the DS3 and hopefully the DS3 Plus program that's going to be rolled out over the next decade, we start to see some of these technologies come onto the Irish electricity grid so that we can literally see wind plus these provide the vast majority of our electricity needs.
Great, thanks, lads. We have an interesting question here, kind of looking at the baseline that was used in the report and in the analysis that was put together. And I suppose questioning whether it's the right kind of baseline. So the viewer is saying, look, this is a great piece of work, it's a great piece of research, but I wonder if using REFIT 2 as a baseline is valid anymore, given that obviously REFIT is closed, but also the RES has changed the pipeline and it's changed the cost profile dramatically. So maybe just to explore that, because it is a REFIT case study that's used in the research, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it kind of is. I would say it's not. I don't think that's entirely correct. So it was an LCOE analysis based on a project that would have been typical of projects that were built under the REFIT regime. So it was based on a 125 meter tip height turbine technology, but it was the baseline that we're comparing everything else to was the LCOE that fell out of the analysis for that, if you want to call it a REFIT style project. But it was, and that happened to land actually relatively close to what would be a REFIT price. But it wasn't. We didn't start and say we're comparing everything against the REFIT price. It was underlying cost assumptions, underlying investment hurdle rates, that drove us to an LCOE that we then compared everything else against. So I don't know if that helps clarify.
Yeah, I think as well. I think that's exactly it, Paul, that it was kind of trying to just take a typical project that was built in the last 10 years as a benchmark. But one thing I would just flag, like it kind of goes back to these results that we showed, the waterfall graph. Like if your view is that a more appropriate baseline would be a 180 meter tip height wind farm, well, then you're effectively starting from here, if you know what I mean. And the analysis would have just worked backwards and said, okay, well, instead of having a 27% saving, going from 180 meters back to 125 meters would be a 27% additional cost, if you know what I mean. So that the starting point, I think, it's almost for communication more so than anything. The analysis, you can almost, if you feel like a different starting point is more appropriate, you could almost pick it, and instead of looking at things as savings from that starting point, there'd be additional costs from that starting point, if that makes sense. So for me, because everything is relative, I'm not sure the starting point is, let's say, would have a huge difference on what the final results would look like.
Cool. Okay, we've 5 questions at the moment. We're due to end at 5:30, so we might be encouraging people to put in their final questions now if they get a chance. I might take the next 2 together. So the first one I think is a really interesting one. So it's when we're looking at these figures, how precise can we actually be when we're looking at capital expenditure and we're looking at OPEX ahead of Res 1, because it's so uncertain in Ireland. And the viewer particularly points to the uncertainty around EirGrid ESB networks in improving and integrating the grid infrastructure. So I suppose that's a question to ask you, is how confident can we be in these figures with that level of uncertainty? And then the second question, just to bring in very quickly, like you were looking in the presentation, David, really about getting the price per megawatt down to 60 euros per megawatt hour or lower, hopefully. Do we think that it's regulations and policy? Is that going to be the main driver that gets us from, say, wind energy in Ireland is 80, 90 euros a megawatt hour, pushing it down to 60 and pushing it down below? Is that really about regulation and policy more than anything else?
Sure, I can take a crack at those, Paul, and feel free to build on. So first on the first one about certainty, so just to make sure people know, the Evros analysis was not a bid price analysis. It was an LCOE, so levelized cost of energy analysis. So from that point of view, it's fairly, let's say, I'd say precise, because it just looks at, if this was my wind farm, what would the LCOE be? This is how much energy I would produce. This is what my assumptions are in costs. This is what I think the change will be for these different measures in my underlying costs. And as a result, this is my change in LCOE. In Appendix 1 of the report, it's very like that gives the, let's say, absolute baseline changes in cost assumptions associated with each of the measures. So like, for example, with some of them, it's very precise, like tip height changes. That means energy yield changes. That means the impact on LCOE is very accurate, and I would say very precise. But with other things like simplified planning, for example, that's more of a change in development risk. You know, if it's a view on what is my view as to the money I will need to spend developing a project, depending on the risk of going through the planning system. That's a bit more open to a bit more subjective, but just to, if people want to see what we assumed in those spaces, it's in Appendix 1, let's say, what a kind of view translated into in terms of numbers, you know, and there you get a feel for maybe if your view is different, what ultimate difference it might make in terms of the LCOE result. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, we are absolutely trying to achieve lower than 60 euros a megawatt hour. 60 euros a megawatt hour is 70 by 30 is cheaper for the consumer than fossil fuels. That's what all Baringa provided us with. But these policy improvements that we've identified should, in theory, take us well below that if they were all implemented. In terms of what will be the drivers of that, it's certainly not only policy, it is absolutely industry developing the technology and driving competition. But I would argue that policy has actually has done a really good job at stimulating industry to do that. Like by having the auctions, by having corporate PPA as your route to market, there's extreme pressure now on price and for industry to deliver at low cost as best we possibly can. And I think that's going to drive industry to innovate and improve technology and build sites that are really cost effective. But there's only so far that can go. And I suppose what the Evros is trying to highlight is, no matter how good your turbine is, if you can't build the best one or you can't use the cheapest one, it's no good having it in an industry. It's no good having a turbine that's 180 meters high and can take quarter of the cost off a price of wind if the regulatory environment doesn't allow you to put it up. And I suppose what we're trying to do with this Everose piece of work is to flag that, yes, industry can do so much, but it's going to be very dependent on the rules of the game that we're playing in as well.
Yeah, not too much to add to that, David. I mean, maybe a couple of things on the certainty points. So, like, as you say, there are certain ones, and if you take commercial rates, would be a good example where it's extremely mechanical in the financial model that, you know, you plug in the number and you get your answer, and there is no doubt about it that, you know, with trebling of commercial rates, that will absolutely mechanically make its way directly into everybody's bid price in the auction. And actually a new one that wasn't even on our radar when we were first doing this analysis was the removal of indexation and refit. And again, that's a very mechanical thing that when you take out the indexation, you remove the indexation of the tariff in the financial model, and mechanically that will generate a higher figure for everybody that goes into the auction. Now, I suppose on that one, it'll mean that the bids that come in day one will be higher than they need to be, but they won't be inflated over time. So what you'll find actually is consumers for the first few years will be paying quite a bit for it, and a number of years down the line that they'll be benefiting from the fact that tariff hasn't gone up over time. But some of the, as you say, some of these things are extremely mechanical, and others that there is some degree of subjectivity. And as you say on the other point, you know, competition will make sure that industry does everything it can to drive its costs down. Like, that's the nature of competition and competitive markets. And, you know, we are moving away from a feed-in tariff to a very competitive market with lots of people competing for a limited pot of capacity. So then outside of that, it's the policy and regulatory environment within which we are all operating. You know, that's the bit we're really trying to focus on here, because we know competition will take care of the industry side. It's what do we need to do outside of that to make sure this is as cheap as possible for consumers, because ultimately, you know, I would say to some extent enduring political support for this transition will be a lot easier to come by if we can make sure that the whole thing is as cost effective as possible. So that's just maybe a few additional points from my side.
Cool, thanks, Paul. Just over 10 minutes left, 3 questions to go. I am very confident in our ability to get through all 3 of them. So just like the first one, we're kind of veering back to the issue of corporate PPAs again. And the viewer highlights the fact that, you know, there are predictions out there that data center demand could be a third of total electricity demand by 2025. And in that kind of context, what's the reasons that a corporate would be hesitant going into a corporate power purchase agreement? Are they concerned about the reliability of supplies, or reliability of supply? Or one question that I've not seen before, do they actually see an advantage in being, you know, on the market and being able to take advantage of the prices moving up and down in CMO?
Do you want to go first, David? Or
no, shoot, yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, like I think at the kind of price points that wind is capable of getting to in the right policy environment, corporates would probably take a view that contracting with wind at that lower price is actually quite a good hedge. And, you know, in terms of their long-term business models, you know, contracting at those low prices for long time periods provides a significant hedge in terms of one of their main operating costs, which would be power. To the point on reliability of supply, I mean, I'm not sure if they're referring to this, and apologies if I'm going to veer off into a slightly complex technical area, but like one concern in terms of the growth of data center demand is if the transmission network is not capable of carrying the power from where it's being generated, say remotely by renewables, to where the demand is, which is tending to be, you know, concentrated around Dublin in terms of data centers, there's a fear that the data centers may start to, you know, install their own fossil fuel plant on site to meet their power needs. And that has a very negative effect on our ability to meet targets, because effectively that starts to act like additional constraint on conventional generation, and that drives curtailment higher. So I think it's certainly important that as data center demand grows, that the network is developed to be able to cater for that. And there's certainly a kind of a concentration of need in Dublin to deal with that.
Yeah, like just 2 quick points from my side. I think one, in terms of what might be, like, even if data centers make up a large part of demand, if we can get the price of renewable electricity lower, I think it's a no-brainer. But I think one thing I would just flag there is certainty is also very valuable. And I think things like, you know, a carbon floor price would be very valuable there, in terms of showing that, you know, if you do tie yourself into a corporate PPA now, you know, electricity market prices, as we add all this wind and it drives the price down and down, that it won't go below a certain level. So, you know, the deal you've made through a corporate PPA is still a good one. So that's not necessarily due to what your price is, but the certainty that the price you're agreeing to right now is a sensible thing, not just today, but out into the future. And I think another interesting one that came up as a question earlier on corporate PPAs, you know, do they feel like they're double paying as well? You know, if you're paying for the corporate PPA to generate renewable electricity in Ireland, but then you're also paying for the PSO on your bill, maybe that's a deterrent as well, that people feel like, well, if I'm going to pay the PSO, let's deliver it that way, as opposed to paying both sides, you know.
Okay. Back to constraints and curtailment with this one. Is being deemed firm or the clean energy package compensation not the real low-hanging fruit? We're kind of talking about those options earlier on. Sharing the pain between the generator and the market with capped dispatch down will provide a great deal of certainty. What do you guys think?
Look, I think my personal opinion is it makes no sense to try and charge an individual wind farm for things like constraints and curtailment, because there's almost nothing an individual wind farm can do to fix that, or at least if they did, they'd be doing it in a way that's certainly suboptimal for Ireland's electricity grid. Like, in other words, if you asked every individual wind farm to fix curtailment and constraints on their own, you would absolutely get a terrible solution for Ireland in terms of how to solve constraints and curtailment. The solutions to constraints and curtailment will be done at a national level centrally by building grid infrastructure where it's needed most, or by putting the types of technologies we talked about earlier in the right place for the electricity grid to be able to be managed. And I think if you start from that principle that the solutions that Ireland needs will happen centrally, well, then the incentive needs to happen centrally. Because if the price and the incentive is happening at the individual wind farm, but the solution is needed centrally, you're incentivizing the wrong people to solve the problem. So I think we have to get to a point where whatever mechanism we use, central compensation or central price signals are made so that centrally, either through EirGrid or CMO or the regulator or something, that there's a basis to invest in the solutions we need to avoid it. So in other words, somebody who's able to fix the problem centrally, let's say the likes of EirGrid through DS3 Plus, sees that this is the cost of constraint and curtailment. So as a result, I'll make these investments to avoid that cost. I think the clean energy package starts trying to do that, but many people might know in the sector, anyone in the wind energy sector will certainly know that there's a lot of uncertainty about how the clean energy package is going to be translated into Ireland. I know, Paul, you've been deeply involved with this with Noel and Bobby on our team. Again, that comes back to uncertainty, and that uncertainty will have to factor in on raised bid prices in some way, shape or form. And that's a cost the consumer has to bear for the uncertainty that we're currently living in. So sorry now with a bit of a few tangents there, but to sum it up, I think central is absolutely what we need to solve the problem, or else we'll never solve the problem properly. And I think the clean energy package puts the framework to try and resolve it, but not convinced just yet that things will necessarily be solved as we think they should.
Yeah, I mean, to just add to that a little bit, I mean, the way I would approach this is, contracting principles 101, commercially efficient contracts result from allocating risk to the party best placed to manage that risk. And as an individual generator bidding into an auction, you literally have zero ability to manage curtailment and constraint over the time frame of the model of your project. So, when we bid into an auction as of today, we're being asked to predict what constraint and curtailment will be at our project for the next 25, 30 years and factor that into our bid price. And we've no ability to control or manage it. So once we're built, we're almost like we're stranded on the system and we have to deal with whatever happens, and we've no ability to control it or limit it. So yeah, I absolutely agree with what David is saying there, that we need to look long and hard at the risk allocation. And I think the point that sometimes gets lost in this is, the constraint and curtailment, there is a cost and somebody has to pay that cost. Excuse me. And ultimately, the consumer will end up paying it kind of one way or another. They'll either pay what we estimate it's going to be and factor into our model, or
through
if there
the
is
PSO
a direct
via bid prices.
Exactly, yeah. Or if in a regime along the lines of the one we're outlining, there will be a direct compensation for what it actually is as opposed to what we estimate it'll be. And to David's point, at least now that cost turns up, and it's transparent, it's visible. You can see exactly how much it's costing to have this constraint on the curtailment on the system. And that then actually allows the people who can do something about it to decide, is it better to simply allow that to happen, or is it better to invest to limit it? But that's something that they can actually manage and control, and that's why the risk is far more appropriately allocated in that direction. Now, look, I think we do have a road to travel on this to kind of convince people that is the right thing to do. But I would say, from a consumer perspective, I really strongly believe that is the right approach in terms of minimizing consumer cost.
Very, very quickly as well from me, Joe, I think what's really important here is that this will be factored in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years maximum. Like, as RAISE is rolled out in the next 3 to 5 years to deliver the projects for 2030, that is locked in then for 15 years of RAISE like that. So the view that people take on this stuff and the the certainty that they put around what might happen to their project over the 25 years that Paul talks about there, like that's not going to be decided over 25 years. It'll be decided in the next 3 to 4 years what will happen, because once res auctions start to materialize and projects start to finance themselves on those assumptions, that's then what's locked in as their bid price.
Yeah, and one final point out there. Sorry, just one final point out there is, like, again, this is an extremely mechanical one. So, in the event that a regime was to be introduced where there was this direct compensation for constraint and curtailment, particularly for firm, and I would say with that softer definition of firm, if you move to that model, sorry, forgive me, I just lost my point there for a second. Actually, sorry, just I'll hand back to you for a second. I've lost my point. I got distracted there for a second.
This is the peril of live webinars, guys. This is what happens.
Yeah.
We practice this, we train for this. But listen, while Paul's just picking up on that, we'll come back to him in a second. The last question we had referred, again, going back to the model that we looked at. The model was kind of highlighting the impact on cost of reduced tip heights. And this viewer wants to know whether that reduction in tip height would apply across the wind farm. So the argument he's making is, maybe the wind turbines at the edge of the wind farm, they might have to reduce tip height, while the wind turbines in the middle of the wind farm would be able to maintain quite high tip height. So you would end up with the wind farm with varying different levels of height of turbine the closer you get to the edge of it.
Yeah, look, I think, Paul, you're probably best placed to answer, but my understanding is that the tip height seems to be uniform across the entire project, and also just there is visualization tests that you have to go through when you apply for planning as well. You'd probably have to factor those in if you started to vary tip heights across a project. But I don't know, Paul, you'd probably be better placed to know, let's say, what the reality is of trying to deliver a project that varies tip height within the single project.
It certainly wouldn't be a normal approach. I wouldn't absolutely rule out that if you were trying to really sweat or optimize a site, that it's something that you wouldn't ever look at. But you wouldn't. It wouldn't be normal. You wouldn't tend to look at it in that way. It tends to be more efficient to have the same dimensions and have the same turbine model. But you could have individual site circumstances where, if you're really trying to sweat the site and come up with the most efficient project, that there could be circumstances where that's something somebody might look to do, but it's not the norm.
I think just one thing to flag as well, just like there is still a huge onshore wind potential in Ireland, just to make sure that that's clear as well. Like, as in, this is not a case of onshore sites need to get every little megawatt hour, like you would from a price point of view, and you absolutely want to do that, but just so that people understand, it's very much driven by trying to get the best value from your project, not driven by we don't have enough onshore wind available to us challenge. Like, if things stay the way they are with the 4 times setback, that's the key point I was trying to make. I think that leaves us in a position where we can use those 180 meter tip heights and still meet the extra 4,000 megawatts that the Climate Action Plan wants us to deliver over the next decade.
Okay, Paul, did you want to go back on that point from a moment ago?
I'm afraid it's gone for me altogether, Justin. I think I got the general point across in my earlier.
I think what you're trying to say, Paul, is just that when it came to the assumptions behind the model, constraints and curtailment is very much an input in, cost out. It's not you take a view. It's almost like once you know what level of constraints and curtailment you think will happen, it's a very mechanical process to then know what impact it has on your levelized cost of energy.
No, thanks, David. Yeah, that was the point, and it's basically that when you introduce that direct compensation model to anyone who's firm, they will simply remove whatever their assumption was from the model, and a lower price will spit out from that model. And yeah, it's exactly that. It's extremely mechanical. So if that policy came in, there would be an immediate response where that cost simply wouldn't be priced in the model, and the saving would be directly passed on to the consumer in the bid price.
And I think, just to maybe put that into lights then as well, Paul, that is a 20 euro megawatt hour odd, or at least a 15 euro, I can't remember the exact number from the slide at the start, but I think it was around 15 euros a megawatt hour when you added the constraints and curtailment. Like, if overnight there was a policy decision that said, no, that will be compensated for centrally and not paid for by individual bids into res, you have literally a 15 euro megawatt hour price wiped off bid prices, approximately, like ballpark, just with the mechanical nature of in-out on res. So that's, again, just going by the numbers that AFRI did for us, you're probably looking at something in the region of over 2 billion euro there of savings for the consumer off res. That gives you a lot of money to fix curtailment and constraints centrally by building the stuff you need to do to fix it. And the worst place that could end up is stuck on the PSO and not getting into the hands of the people that could actually then use it to fix the problem. Because
okay, well, listen, thanks very much, guys. You've answered literally every question anybody could ever have about lowering the cost of renewable electricity in 90 minutes. I just hand it back to yourself, Paul. That's it from me. That's all of the questions we had. So
thanks,
just
Justin.
thank you very much to everybody who put a question and participated in the discussion.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, and listen, just from myself, just say thanks to David and thanks to Justin and the team at IWEA for organising the webinar. And as I said at the outset, the webinar itself will be recorded and made available. And the Saving Power report, I believe, is now available on the IWEA website, David.
Yep.
And I guess, as we said earlier, 3 more exciting reports to follow, and probably more webinars down the line as well. So yeah, just thanks everyone for joining the call, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in the future, hopefully in person in the not too distant future, but we'll have to make do with these webinars for the moment, I think.
Thanks for hosting, Paul. See you, everyone.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks, folks. Take care now. Bye-bye.